Welcome back. As President Trump headed to Singapore on Air Force One, he blasted the Canadian Prime Minister. This is the tweet, quote, Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting and will not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak. Our tariffs in response to his 270% on dairy. To weigh in, our talk radio panel, Chris Stigall, heard in the city of brotherly love, where evidently he was able to find his suit jacket finally, and Garland Nixon on the dial here in Washington. Gentlemen, nice to see you. Chris, we know the president's supporters love the tough talk. They love a president who's seen as fighting back either at home or on the world stage. Counterpunching, they call it. Do they distinguish between punching at our allies and punching at our adversaries?
It seems like all the right people, if you're a Trump supporter, all the right people are really ticked off this morning. I got to tell you, when you see John McCain saying most of we American voters are globalists, and you see all the foreign heads of state screaming and yelling, I don't know, Leland, the worm has turned a bit, and I think Americans are waking to the fact that all the right people, like I said, seem to be upset. And so while, look, we don't know the details and nothing's in stone, I don't think you're going to find a lot of Americans that say, oh, gosh, we ought to spend more time considering what Canada wants. What's making Canada unhappy?
Well,
it's not really our nature.
On that note, Garland, there were a lot of Democrats you could add to Chris's list of people who were upset this morning. Dianne Feinstein on some of the Sunday shows sort of almost seeming to lose their mind over how the president was treating the Canadians, but the Democrats don't seem to be making any headway off of being so angry about that.
Well, I think the other perspective is this. If we get away from whether or not, which party it's going to be benefit or the Trump base.
Garland, dare to dream. Find a time in Washington lately that it's not all about which party is going to benefit from something.
So I'm going to try to step above that a little bit and say and say this. One of the things that the chief diplomat has to do for this country or any country is strike deals. The problem I have here is that the president gave his word that he would do something. After he left, he became offended and he went back on his word. Now he's going to Singapore to strike a deal. If there's one thing that international diplomacy requires, it is stability. And I think people are going to look at this and say, well, if we strike a deal with this guy and he gets upset when he leaves, he might change his mind. So I don't think it's in the best interest of the country as far as being able to make deals with our allies or our enemies in the future.
We'll get Chris's response to that quickly. If you listen to the administration, Larry Kudlow on CNN a little bit earlier said this hitting back, if you will, and presenting this front to the Canadian Prime Minister was all about the North Korean deal. Take a listen.
I personally negotiated with Prime Minister Trudeau, who, by the way, I basically liked working with, but not until this sophomoric play. Here's the thing. He really kind of stabbed us in the back.
Question, Chris, for you. Such tough language about the Canadians, but you see what the Chinese are doing, whether it be hacking into our military warfare plans, as they just did with the U.S. Navy, whether it be on ZTE and some of the things that company did, or their other mobile phone companies. We don't see that kind of harsh rhetoric against the president of China. We see it against the president, or the prime minister, rather, of Canada.
Oh, I think Trump has had a lot of harsh rhetoric towards China. Look at what China effectively did to bring us to Singapore. Don't discount how much China had to do with bringing North Korea to the table in this upcoming summit, because they knew Trump was a guy who said...
Did the U.S. give up too much to China to have the Chinese do that?
Oh, I don't know that we've given up anything yet.
The ZTE deal?
Well, but if it means we're sitting down to the table now with North Korea and we're talking about a potential, nuclear summit that could turn into a peace accord for the Korean Peninsula, I don't know, give and take. Something else I'll say, Trump has consistently, much like domestically, when he's talked about, the border situation, all he wants is a secure border, and he's willing to grant the DACA folks, the Dreamer folks, what the Democrats want. They won't secure the border. Similarly with Canada and these other nations, all Trump said, no tariffs, and we'll sign a deal. They won't take a no tariffs deal. Why is that exactly?
All right, Garland, you get the last word if you have an answer for that one.
Well, I think that we're going to see how this affects the upcoming deals. I think what we're looking at now is a lot of countries are going to be looking at the Russias and the Chinas and saying, you know what, maybe making a trade deal with them is more stable. I may not be able to trust them on some things, but at least they're keeping their words on trade, and it's going to hurt us because we are in competition with these countries when it comes to international trade.
We've certainly seen the Chinese expanding in Africa and South America as well, especially down near the Panama Canal. Gentlemen, appreciate both of you being here. Always good to see you, Chris. Suit jacket or not, buddy. We'll see you soon. Looks good. There you go.
Fallout from the G7 summit continues as President Trump again calls out Canada and other key U.S. allies on trade. The president tweeting, "Sorry, we cannot let our friends or enemies take advantage of us on trade anymore. We must put the American worker first." Griff Jenkins is live in Washington. Griff, good morning.
Good morning, Sandra. It appears the president is escalating the start of a trade war with America's closest allies, unleashing a barrage of tweets in the wake of the G7, some aimed at Canada's prime minister, as you mentioned, like this one. He says fair trade is now to be called fool trade if it is not reciprocal. According to a Canada release, they make almost $100 billion in trade with U.S. Guess they were bragging and got caught. Minimum is $17 billion. Tax area from us at 270%. Then Justin acts hurt when called out. This all began when the president shook things up in Quebec, but then became furious when Trudeau held a news conference after his departure and said this.
Would be with regret, but it would be with absolute certainty and firmness that we move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
That prompting the president to withdraw his agreement to the group's communique and infuriating administration officials with harsh words coming from the president's trade policy advisor, Peter Navarro.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door.
And Sandra, the fallout continues with G7 leaders like Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel calling the situation, quote, depressing and vowing tariff retaliation as well. Perhaps one positive note, overnight trading was mostly up in the euro, getting a bounce despite heightened worries over this what would be a ensuing global trade war.
Robert De Niro set off an S-storm at the Tony Awards by saying F Trump, and the liberal Hollywood crowd giving a standing ovation, cursing out the president. But the coverage of President Trump and what happened at the G7 summit in Quebec, not all that different. I mean, minus the cursing with a little more subtlety. But really, there's a lot of blank Trump notes in the coverage. Now, I'm not saying that what the president did obviously alienated some of America's allies, used very tough talk and personalized the battle over tariff, especially with Justin Trudeau. I'm not saying that's not a huge story. And I'm certainly not saying the president doesn't deserve his share of criticism for the way he handled it. But there seems to be, in some of the straight news stories and among some of the commentators, a sense that the president is not, using his negotiating style to try to protect American workers and get a better deal and maybe in the end he'll compromise. It's just like the guy's unhinged, he's crazy, this is what he does. He's nicer to our adversaries than he is to our allies. And I just wonder whether or not it amounts to a big middle finger. I mean, here's a column in the New York Times by David Leonhardt. Trump tries to destroy the West. Not that he is destroying the West or the old trade order, but he's trying to blow up the Western Alliance. CNBC's John Harwood tweeted, Trump resumes baseless rant against friendly democracy next door. Trump reacted irrationally, and then advisors made stuff up to make it sound like there was a rational basis for his irrationality. It's always fascinating to me the way some of the fiercest critics of President Trump almost fall into the trap of going as overboard as they accuse him of doing when they really get riled up, as they have over the G7 business. Now, there is simply no question. One of the guests on my show the other day said, well, when it comes to covering, world trade and tariffs and the G7, the press oversimplifies it and makes it too personality based. And there's a lot of truth to that. But how do you not make it personality based when the President of the United States, after meeting in Canada, goes on this tweet storm when Air Force One goes after Justin Trudeau, says, oh, he acted meek and mild in our discussions, but he's very dishonest and weak. And then after bringing up this 270% Canadian dairy tariff, the President goes on to say, then Justin acts hurt when called out. Look, this is what the President does. Sometimes he goes too far. He personalizes every dispute. He does it with American allies. He does it with some adversaries. He does it with domestic opponents. And he certainly does it with those of us in the news business who he calls fake news journalists. That's his style. Sometimes it works for him. Sometimes it doesn't work so well. So again, absolutely important story to cover, absolutely fair game to criticize the president's style. Why did he jet off to a meeting with dictator Kim Jong-un after picking a huge fight with Canada? It's not to say that, we shouldn't renegotiate tariffs with Canada, but Justin Trudeau was nowhere near as pointed or as critical the president as the president was of him. So now we have the Canadian front in the war on words. But I just think when you get down to reading motivation and saying he wants this, he likes blowing things up. There was a much fairer story in the Washington Post which said President Trump's having the time of his life because he's doing things unilaterally now with allies, on tariffs, with the nuclear summit. And that it seems to be working for him, says the Post, because his poll numbers, as I noted last week, have been going up. A fair approach to the president includes criticism and also includes a perspective from his side. We're seeing a lot less of that in the wake of the train wreck at the G7.
All right, two of the best from Fox Business joining me right now. I got Susan Lee and Charlie Gasparino, and I'm so glad you guys joined me because I need to make sense of how the markets are handling this whole Korea thing, the post-trade thing.
Where do we end up today?
We're up about 5-7 points, but nothing. What's going on?
Yeah, we came off the session highs though, but pushing closer to 2,800 for the S&P. That's the high that we haven't seen since March. And traders that I talked to say, we could see a positive surprise from North Korea later on tonight because it's not just a two-way summit. It's not just North Korea and the U.S. China is involved as well. We know Kim Jong-un flew to Singapore on an Air China jet.
Right.
If all of that goes well and there's a positive surprise, there could be possibly some positive surprise and good rhetoric for the China-U.S. trade relationship as well.
And as you've been reminding me, the underlying fundamentals of what markets respond to, and the earnings have been great. The balance sheets are good, and
it's getting better.
And even if things are going kablooey with our trading partners, it's okay.
Well, listen, everything looked hunky-dory in late 2007 to early 2008, and I remember when the switch went on and it wasn't. And I would just say this. If Donald Trump gets peace in our time with this deal, markets will go up. Okay, gotcha. If he gets nothing and he just doesn't do anything bad, markets will trade off other issues. But this trade stuff that he's doing, the roll of the dice, I think the market isn't. Right now, the markets are just saying
because it doesn't think anything's going to happen.
We don't think it's going to happen. Right. But there have been sort of unexpected stuff that came in the past. It always does. And let me tell you something. You have tax cuts which are going to increase the size of the deficit, meaning we're going to get marginally higher interest rates anyway because we have to sell more debt. If you got that,
not if the growth goes at the rate it's going.
But if it doesn't initially, and usually it takes a little while, if it doesn't pay for itself, you're going to have a trade war on top of much higher interest rates.
So there are a lot of worries
good.
About that. When you talk to people, Susan, and of course, you sat down with the Canadian Prime Minister before everything hit the proverbial fan. There's a lot of ill will out there now, and I'm wondering how that's reverberating.
Well, as I mentioned, it's actually making Justin Trudeau look pretty good in Canada because yesterday, if you went and watched any of the Canadian Airways, read any Canadian newspaper,
sort of rallying around the leader.
It's a big, bad U.S. bully coming in to tell us what to do. And if, Justin Trudeau is standing up to him, well, hey, maybe, he might not be a bad, strong leader for Canada in the next elections. Which,
he's
behind the polls.
Response, I found it unfathomable the comments that were made about Justin Trudeau, whatever you think of this trade deal. But you're going to rally around the leader, conservatives, liberals alike, right?
Correct, and that's what happened from both sides of the aisle. So in some ways, you know, I guess there's been a bipartisan effect in Canada thanks to Donald Trump.
Why do you think he did this? The president did this, or Peter Navarro said there's a special place in hell for
I think that was all sort of
drama?
Yeah, gamesmanship for the Korean thing.
In what way?
Well, to show that, you know, we're not going to take anybody's garbage and we're going to fight you. And but that said, you know, their words do matter, and if you spit in the eye of the G7, who are nominally, at least in name, people we can use to blunt the growth of China as an economic superpower looking to take over the world, that's a real problem. Like I said, right now the markets aren't recognizing that trade is an issue. They've grown comfortable with Trump. They like most of his fiscal policies. They like his deregulatory agenda. They don't think he's going to press the button on trade. However, markets are often wrong, and if he does press the button, if there is a wide-ranging trade war, if China doesn't kick in what they're supposed to kick in after we let ZTE survive, if there's a problem with trade and we got a trade problem, when we have higher interest rates, that could be a problem.
You just said markets are usually wrong. Is that what you said?
They're often wrong.
They're often wrong. Well, you know, I'm looking at the Russell 2000, the small caps index,
That's right.
If there's rotation to small caps, what does that say about political risk? It says that people don't, you know, they're going to smaller companies, not large ones that might be more impacted by trade regulation.
They're also looking for yield and for growth.
And the yield's below 3% still on a week that it's
well, so far they're looking the other way, right?
I'm saying you increase your risk profiles right before the markets usually blow up. That always happens.
That doesn't mean they will blow up.
But it often happens.
Someone's a Debbie Downer here. All right, we'll see what happens.
Well, at the same time that President Trump is preparing to sit down with one of the U.S.'s greatest adversaries, he's also essentially backing out of a deal with some of the U.S.'s greatest allies. This weekend, at that meeting of the G7 leaders in Quebec, it was already tense, as captured in this photo. German Chancellor Angela Merkel staring off with President Trump, then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held that press conference that you were just talking about, where he announced that his country would be moving forward with those retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. starting July 1st.
I don't want to hurt American workers. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. But my job is to stand up for Canadian workers, Canadian interests, and I will do that without flinching.
Now, Trudeau's office says that the prime minister didn't say anything in that press conference that he hadn't already said to President Trump in public and in private conversations. But something in those remarks clearly set the president off. Shortly after he accused Trudeau on Twitter of being very dishonest and weak, he announced the possibility of even more tariffs, this time on automobile imports. And most importantly, he withdrew his endorsement of the G7's joint statement, which the U.S. had just agreed to. The White House's top economic and trade advisor place all the blame squarely on Trudeau.
He really kind of stabbed us in the back. He really actually, you know what? He did a great disservice to the whole G7.
To my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history.
But some members of Congress, including some Republicans, worry that perhaps the White House has gone too far here. And Republican Senator John McCain went so far as to put out this statement to our allies. He said on Twitter, quote, "Americans stand with you, even if our president does not." But President Trump seems perhaps more convinced than ever that the U.S. is continuing to get ripped off. He said just today that he will now call fair trade fool's trade unless it's reciprocal. And Martha, of course, all of this leaves those ongoing NAFTA negotiations very much just kind of blowing in the wind. Nobody knows really what's going to happen there.
Joining me now, Steve Hilton, host of The Next Revolution here on Fox News Channel. Steve, good to see you. What do you make of all this?
It's one of my favorite topics. So this illustrates the whole point of Donald Trump. All the people are going around saying, in the establishment, the foreign policy elite, saying this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. The whole point of Donald Trump was to be unprecedented. People wanted a change. They feel that for decades, whoever wins elections, you get the same policies. Globalization, stuff that benefits big business but hurts small business and working people. And they want to change from all that. And finally, you see a president who goes into these meetings. Susan Rice is right to say that he blew it up But that's what people want,
exactly
and that's what you need, because actually the international order that they talk about so fondly, it hasn't worked for anyone except the elite, and that's what Donald Trump was elected to change.
It's fascinating to me because, you know, you watch his meetings and you look at that picture of all of them standing around the table, and I love Abe. He's like, you talk to him, you know, standing in the back. But I think you're absolutely right, and, you know, whether or not it will work out in President Trump's favor, we have no idea at this point. But it wouldn't surprise me at all a month from now to see some sort of deal between Canada and the United States where, you know, where the parity is a little bit closer.
That's right.
I just want to show Stephen Harper, the former Canadian Prime Minister, was talking to Maria Bartiromo, and here's what he said. He doesn't believe that we are not at parity.
Not only is the trade deficit with Canada small, the United States runs a current account surplus with Canada. Canada is the biggest single purchaser of U.S. goods and services in the world. It's not China, it's not Mexico, it's not Britain, it's not Germany, it's Canada.
See, the diplomats and the bureaucrats have this brilliant way of trying to smooth everything over, and they point to things like that, and they look at averages, and they get these statistics out there, but they cover up the reality for individual industries and for people. So, for example, when the president points to something that's very specific, which is the dairy industry, there's a massive disadvantage. And that's his skill, really, is to say, you can come with all your statistics, but what I'm interested in is how it affects individual working Americans. And the fact is that exactly as you say, this is not President Trump starting a trade war. This is President Trump, on behalf of the people who voted for him, standing up for their interests after decades in which they have come second to the interests of global corporations who really don't care about people in one country or another. They just care about the efficient way of doing things, wherever that may be. And that's just empowered countries like China at our expense.
And you're right that he gets specific about it. He'll say, you know, how many F-150 Ford trucks have you seen driving around Germany? Ask yourself that, folks. And there's a reason why you're not seeing a lot of them. And Justin Trudeau is clearly putting on his Trumpiest Trump act in that moment, and the president pushed back. So we'll see where it goes. Great to have you here.
So great to be with you here. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for being here.